Good afternoon. Okay, we'll just give it another minute because still only have about a dozen students here. Okay, I think we've got enough to get started. I'll just admit people as they join. So I want to spend a lot of today's lecture going through some live coding examples. And I definitely want you all to feel free to speak up if you have any particular coding questions that you would like to be covered. This will go for the next lecture as well. My goal here is to really give you all templates to help you understand what you might need to do to make your prototype feel alive. Um, but before I start, does anyone have any specific questions that maybe you feel an answer might help you get going on your projects, or any concerns that you've observed in the past week? Okay, great. Well, without further ado, I will continue on. So the title of this is JavaScript and Dynamic Pages because that's what I want to introduce you to. But I think in the last lecture, we only just started touching on how to actually code a good looking page. So we'll also talk a little bit about how you can set your pages up using the Bootstrap grid format, how you can style your different elements and so forth. So we'll do that. And then once we've done that, we'll then use some JavaScript to make those elements come alive. Okay, what is JavaScript? So it's not Java. Some people sometimes get the two confused. They're really completely different languages. So the only thing they share is those first four letters. And it's a scripting language that makes the static HTML page do stuff. It's run by the browser. And this is a big differentiation between JavaScript and other backend languages, such as Python, Java, or PHP. Those backend languages are typically done on the server level, which means they're completely invisible to the user themselves. They just do work on the backend to maybe interface with different APIs or different databases, and then use whatever they come up with to display interesting content on screen. So when you see, let's say Instagram, if you go on an Instagram account and you see a bunch of photos associated with that account, That's a backend language that is querying a database and saying, okay, based on this account page that the user is visiting, what photos are associated with that account page. They also might use that backend language to then calculate, based on the user who is actually viewing this page, what might be a good ad to show them. So that's backend. JavaScript, while it's sort of, it has a lot of backend elements, it's still a front end script in the sense that it is run by the browser itself. So it's not behind the scenes. It's not on the server level. It's actually completely visible to the user themselves. So I showed you in the last lecture how you can inspect a page. If you do that, you can actually look at their JavaScript code. And the reason you can do that is because it's your own browser that is executing that code. Some uses, typical use cases for JavaScript are to display or hide HTML content. We'll get at that in our practical part of the lecture. So you could imagine maybe clicking a button, and then when you click that button, it displays, maybe it opens up a map, maybe it shows a video, and anything of that sort. You can also use it to change HTML content. Let's say that you want to highlight a word, maybe in red. So change the color from black to red. If they click it, that's something you could do with JavaScript. If you want to emphasize something, maybe make an image spin or flip to whatever the next image is that you want to show, you can do that through JavaScript. It also can react to user inputs. I don't know if we'll get to this. If we don't get to it in this lecture, we'll get to it in next week's lecture. But you can essentially create an algorithm where maybe a user will put in, the example that we'll go on is a diabetes diagnosis tool. And if the user puts in their H1C levels and their blood pressure levels, maybe their obesity status, then it will give them a prediction of whether or not they have diabetes. So you can take those inputs and use them to create some sort of output like a diagnosis. You can also use JavaScript to create cookies. So you all might have heard of cookies. I'm sure you've seen when you visit a specific website that they say, are you okay with us tracking your cookies? Does anyone know what cookies are actually used for? Are there any examples where they're used? And Pablo?
They used to like target like specific ads. So like you accept cookies from like a variety of different websites, and all of a sudden like all of your ads are being very like focused on what you've already like searched.
Yep, that's definitely one of the major ways in which websites use cookies. So what they'll do is they'll know who you are based on some of the cookies that they've stored, how you've interacted with their site in the past. And then it started as very much a convenience thing, right? If you visit a site and you always go to, let's say the patient side of the site, it's helpful for that site to actually know, okay, this user likes the patient side. But there's definitely been some questions about privacy with cookies and whether or not using those cookies is an invasion of the privacy just so that they can make more money selling ads. I know when I was ring shopping for my wife, every website that I seemed to go on would advertise rings, which, for me was horrible because I didn't want her to, maybe I'm showing her some website and all of a sudden there's a bunch of engagement rings. So sometimes cookies can be a little bit too smart in how they show you your ads. Mary, I know that you had your hand up. Did you still want to share something about cookies? Okay, looks like she might have stepped away. Jihao?
Yeah, so I think cookies will also record your login infos and like a little bit of history, I think.
Yeah, exactly. So without cookies, it is difficult to know whether someone logged in. And so if you aren't allowing them to track your cookies, you might have to log in more frequently than you otherwise would have. So that's definitely a good use of cookies. One way to really truly understand how cookies can help you as a user would be to visit a site that you normally visit a lot, but in incognito mode, right? Or in the private mode of your browser, where they can no longer track your cookies. They don't know your IP, and they don't know anything about you. And you'll see that it's sort of a slightly different presentation, and a little bit less tailored maybe to your previous usage habits on that site. Okay, so we're going to definitely talk about cookies. That'll probably be more next lecture, but we're going to use it as a little bit of a crutch. So we don't have enough time in this course to teach you database. And without that, it's hard to create user accounts, things like that. So what we will do is we'll use cookies to maybe register a user and then remember from their browser what that user's information is. And then that can be sort of our makeshift database, right? We'll use JavaScript to store that information as a cookie, and then we will retrieve that information to populate certain parts of our site if that's something that we want to do. And then creating browser alerts. So a good example would be clicking the unsubscribe button, maybe from an email list, right? You do that on a web page. And then sometimes it says, are you sure? We'd hate to see you go, that sort of thing. So you could create those sort of alerts, or maybe someone's about to click a very important button. Maybe it's a button that determines the dosage that a patient is going to receive from their infusion pump. Before they do that, you might want to have an alert pop up that can say, here's what you're about to do. Are you sure you'd like to proceed? And you can do all that through JavaScript. Mary, you were raising your hand earlier. Did you still? Okay, great. So we will.
Said it. It was about the cookies.
Awesome. Okay, so we're just going to dive straight into coding. I want to. I wish that I had more time last lecture to explain a little bit about the coding part. And so in this lecture, I want to really focus. I want to go slow. I want you all to interrupt me often. I want you all to sort of get it. I want it to click with you about how you can code and have that turn into something really cool on your webpage. So before I dive into this, any questions?
Like a bookkeeping type question.
Uh-huh.
A good amount of us have class or work during your office hours.
Gotcha.
And like I have to take off part of work, go into work late just to make office hours on Thursday to get help.
Yeah, so I'm always available by email, and you could use email to request a different time. So I'm definitely open. I would appreciate at least a day's notice, but if it's an emergency, we could probably make something work within the day.
Can we have like multiple members of our team in the office hours appointment?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. In fact, I would definitely encourage that if it's a team question. That way we can sort of avoid the translation issues sometimes of someone.
Yes, because period tracker code's gotten wonky. Thank you.
All right. So definitely, if anyone wants to meet outside the office hours, I will make myself available. Especially, I mean, these are some critical weeks. So especially in these next couple weeks, if you need help, please reach out. Send me an email, and if we can't address it through writing, let's just schedule a time that works for everyone. And if it's a team thing and you'd like multiple team members, try to, when you send me an email, say, these are some times that'll work for us. And then I'll choose among those times and try to make it work. Okay. Any other questions? Okay, let's get started with some code.
It's a code question.
Yes.
So some of the active parts of the website can be done in HTML, like making the buttons activated or like a drop down menu. How do you know when to do that in the HTML or have your JavaScript code doing that instead?
Are we talking about sort of like a nav bar drop down, or?
Yeah, like if you have buttons on your navigation bar, making them active, we've seen it in my team's seen it on the JavaScript side, and we've also seen it on the HTML side, and we're just not sure what part that should be in terms of this class.
Yeah. So, and another question I'd have for you is, when you're talking about that, are you talking about actually having JavaScript code within the HTML, or are we saying just using like Bootstrap?
No, like calling it in, like using Java to make the backend and having it be part of the backend.
So,
and I've seen it being like called in like a specific function into the HTML.
Yeah, I'll show you. So if we say Bootstrap Navbar, right? Then here we can get a very good explanation of what the Bootstrap Navbar can do without having to use any JavaScript code. So here you can see, okay, these are all the different possibilities of what I could do. So I could make a navbar that looks like this, has like these little highlights that happen. And I don't have to use any JavaScript code for any of that, right? Right. So this looks like, I think, a good example, I think, Mary, of what you're talking about, where this totally looks like a JavaScript function, right? Mm-hmm. But if you notice, they're not using any JavaScript for it. They're just taking advantage of what Bootstrap has to offer. So what I would say is start with the non-JavaScript option, right? If you're using the Bootstrap Navbar or any of these other Bootstrap components, because that's an engine or a package that you've implemented as part of our learning. If it does it already, don't try to reinvent the wheel. Just use what they've got. However, if you want this to like spin around, right? When someone clicks it and you see that Bootstrap does not offer that option, then that's when you start to look at, okay, I might have to code this myself in JavaScript. And so you can start Googling around how to make an element spin with JavaScript. And then that will work, right? So it's sort of start with you always start with the simplest possible option. So start with the non-JavaScript option. And then if it's not doing exactly what you want it to do, then start to look into writing custom JavaScript code to make it happen. So that's the Bootstrap example. Another example, like you mentioned, Java or drop downs, right? So HTML forms, which I believe you learned through Codecademy, they have certain built-in elements too, right? So let's see if they have the like a checkbox, right? This kind of looks like JavaScript, right? I'm clicking something and then it's filling in with a blue check mark. But because when we were learning HTML forms, we realized that if we just format these a certain way using this kind of template, then it will do these dynamic things for us. Okay, so that's another example. So we got Bootstrap, which does a lot of fancy things, and you just sort of have to read through the documentation of what it is capable of. And then there's things like the HTML form elements where you can do checkboxes. I'm sure drop down is somewhere here as well. Let's do select. Okay, so I think that's somewhere different, but if I do HTML form select options, then I think here's the page where I should be able to find that, right? So select. So if I use this template, then it comes with a sort of drop down built in, right? So that looks fancy, looks like JavaScript, but because it's just what is a part of the HTML, you don't need to use any JavaScript. Okay. A lot of coding, frankly, is Googling. So it's like you have the basic skills that you get through these lectures, And then if you just say, hey, I would like some sort of drop-down menu, type HTML drop-down menu, and then that will almost certainly get you to where you need to be to see what's available. Okay. And, you know, if all that fails, then you can always just ask me. Okay, so this is where we are with our code. Let's copy the relative path and let's look at it. Oops. I must not have copied it. Copy relative. Oh, it's because I said relative path. So common mistake. Copy path, not relative path. And now it's going to give the path to the index file in my computer. Okay, now it shows up. Still kind of ugly, right? So one thing that I did wrong in the lecture was I actually put the logo outside of the navbar. So if I just copy all that and then put it within the navbar, all of a sudden it looks good again. Okay, so there's that. I still have our link to an About Us page. I think identity was a drop down. So now I have a decent, not a great looking, but a decent looking navbar. If I wanted, let's say I was the CSS person on the team, maybe I'd work on making the logo a little bigger. You know, if I want to use a different font or a different color, I could do that. So all those are options. Okay. And if I want to make changes to the navbar functions, then I would just Google Bootstrap Navbar. And now I've got all sorts of cool things that I could do with what Bootstrap offers. Okay. One other thing, I've gotten the question of, is this for desktop or mobile? The answer is there's really three approaches you could do. You could say, you know what, my application, it's really more of a computer thing. And so I just want to code this as a desktop application, and that's fine. Other people might say, you know what, this is really more of an app. So I want this to look like an app. Now, if you want it to look like an app, my recommendation is when you are testing it in your browser, inspect to bring up this thing. So this is, remember what we were doing when we could like inspect what the code was behind a page. Another cool thing that inspect does is you can see this button right here, which says toggle device toolbar. If I click it, now all of a sudden, I've got something that looks like a mobile phone, right? So all I would have to do is when I'm doing my testing, just do it in this mobile phone looking screen. And then I can even, you know, if I want to, 2 weeks from now, present it as if it were a mobile app. And that's very common. We call that mobile first programming. So sort of everything that we're doing, everything that we want it to look like starts with how it should look on mobile. And you can see if I were doing that, this navbar just wouldn't really fly. And so I might want to look on the Bootstrap navbar page how to make a mobile thing. And what I was showing you to answer Mary's question about the when is JavaScript appropriate or not, you saw that very last thing that they talked about in Bootstrap Navbar. That was kind of like a mobile navbar where they've got the 3 lines, you click it, and then it expands a navbar. So that would be a template that you could use to make this look more mobile friendly. Okay. Third option is you could try to do both, right? And that might be something, of course, it's a little bit more work to make something that looks good on desktop and good in mobile, but if that's what you want your focus to be, and you do that well, then that means you don't have to maybe focus as much on other elements of the web page, right? Because you're saying, you know what, our focus was we wanted a page that looked really nice in mobile and desktop, and we put a lot of work into that. And that will be a lot to impress me, right? They call that responsive web pages. So it means it's responding to the screen size. And we can talk a little bit about that next lecture if that's something that you all are interested in learning about. Okay, so back to here. One thing I fixed was putting the logo back into the navbar, and that helped. Another thing I want to do is I'd like to maybe give myself a better title. So how about we call this the ALS414 menu of cool features. I just changed my header text, reload, and now it says that. So what I want to do now is I want to maybe list a bunch of different features. And then after we've done that, after we've created this menu on our home page, we can then maybe link to other files that will show us some of these cool features. And so we can use that moving forward to, if you all have questions, hey, I want to see how I can display a video or display a map on my page, then we can add that to our menu of cool features. So for now, let's put a few placeholders, right? So I'm going to do a div element. The reason I choose div, and this is really something where there's no necessary right or wrong answer of whether I do a div or I maybe just put an image or something there. The reason I would do a div is because I'm thinking, okay, I have a menu and I would like to put whatever I'm putting here in its own space, okay? And then I can do things with that space later on. And so that's what I'm thinking right now. I'd like to have each menu item have its own dedicated space that we can format as we'd like. So within here, why don't we say we want a feature called algorithms. Okay, and then let's copy that, put another one. Maybe we'll call this videos. How about another one we'll call maps. And then another one, well, here, I'll take requests. Is there anything anyone would like to see maybe in the next couple weeks, me do an example of? So we got algorithms, videos, maps. Anything else? Maybe think about your own project and what you'd like to see. Mary?
A lot, like a message board, an interactive message board.
Messaging.
And yeah, Kavya said chat in a chat in the
Okay.
chat. Haha, she said chat in chat. Haha. Sorry.
Let's do chat. I like short words on main menus, right? Because they're just easier. In fact, algorithms is almost too long, but it's at least it's one word, so that'll work. Okay. Anything else?
Not for like to list out in that, but if you could show us how to orientate, so you having a side navigation panel bar.
Sure.
That's just like stays.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we could definitely talk about that, and that should be something that we can have that's built in within the Bootstrap. Okay.
That's the wonky part, FYI, of our code.
Okay, so that's a good thing to bring up. And this sort of goes along with copying code. If you use an engine, sort of like Bootstrap, or if you try to copy some code you found on CodePen, stuff will be wonky. There will be stuff you don't fully understand. It'll save you time on the design because you can just use their pre-existing designs. But you might have to like really read deep into the documentation or do some research to understand. Otherwise it will, and this is a technical term in coding, it will be wonky because it just won't work right. And you won't know why until you do more research. That's it even happens to me now, right? Where I'll sort of grab a piece of code or maybe work with a new engine and it just is not doing what I expect. And the reason is because maybe I didn't read the 100 pages of documentation. And I just sort of tried code that worked. So that's sort of always the buyer beware element of using these engines like Bootstrap or trying to implement someone else's code. But we can talk through that a little bit. Okay, so I have, doesn't look like much, but I've got these sections and they're all within divs, so I can start to do things with them. Now, one thing I want to put in all my divs, and I don't know if I've told you about this, but Visual Studio Code and really all text editors, they do this cool thing called multiple cursors. So if I hit Command or Control D, then you can see, oh, and I highlighted the div. You can see that each time I clicked Command D, it would highlight another matching thing. So almost like a Control F find feature. But this is actually giving me 4 different cursors. So this way, I can start typing the same thing in each of them. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use, this is another thing that's built in within Bootstrap, something called the grid format. Okay, so what is the grid format? It's basically something that's divided into 12 segments. And if I say call XS12, what I'm essentially saying is that each of these div elements is going to take up all 12 of the slots. And it's going to do that all the way until the extra small screen size, which is basically your mobile device. So it shouldn't actually change anything, but let's see. It might move things a little bit indented, but it shouldn't do much at all. There you go. So it indented a little bit as I reloaded. Now, let's actually style these a little bit so that we can see what the boxes look like. So we're going to say border is 1 pixel solid black. Okay, now I can see that each of my elements is basically the full width of the screen, and they take up the whole screen. Let's also maybe make them a little bit more square-like. So we can say padding is, how about 50 pixels? So I have some spacing around it, okay? So now they're starting to look a little bit more like menu items, very ugly menu items, but menu items nevertheless. And then just to make it even nicer, we'll say margin is about 20 pixels. Okay, so now they're not all on top of each other. And then how about another nice thing? We'll do border radius is 4 pixels. So that's just going to round my corners a little bit. Cool. And then let's do one more thing. How about, background color is about tan. All right. So now I've got maybe something that looks a little bit more like a menu. Okay. So back to this. So the call is just everything starts with the COL because we're talking about how we want to format our columns within the page. The middle element XS is sort of like until what screen size. So we're saying all the way up to the smallest possible screen size is XS. And then 12 means at that smallest possible screen size and above, because I haven't set any other rules, we want it to be 12. Now, if I highlight all the 12s, create my 4 cursors again using Command or Control D, and then change that to, how about 3? Okay, so remember, the grid is based on 12 segments. And if I make that number 12, it means it's taking up all 12 segments. So would anyone like to venture to guess what is going to happen now that I've changed that number 12 to 3? What do you think will happen when I reload the page? What will this start to look like? Mary?
My best guess is it's definitely, it's columns, so it's the spacing. So I'm assuming it's going to be the thickness of the beige. It might be like a thinner, or it might be squished. So it's definitely it's a dimension of the columns.
Yeah, so it's going to be squished. And then the other part is you're actually now going to put these on the same line, right? So now, because we're working with 12 segments, 4 of these in theory will all fit on one line. So you might have, we'll see, algorithms next to videos, next to maps, and then next to chat, right? The reason I say maybe is because we put this margin around. So you might actually get just the 3 that fit on the page, and then chat will be on the next line, but let's find out. Yeah.
I have a question
Mhm.
about your code for assigning the color of the font. When do you use the RGB numerical code for it with the hashtag, and when do you write the
So the
word?
writing is just a shortcut for the numerical code. So the numerical code, frankly, is the better way to do it. I just don't know those codes off the top of my head. But I can sort of like highlight over, and then I can maybe change it. So how about we make it like a light blue instead? So now it's this RGB code. Then I'll highlight my tans, Control D to get my 3 cursors, and then replace each of the tans with that same light blue. Now I reload and it's light blue. So it's better to use the RGB or the hexadecimal. That's the one where it's like a hashtag and then some alphanumeric of I think 5 letters. But just because, you know, I'm trying to code like off the top of my head and I sort of under the pressure of everyone staring at me, it's easier for me to just write tan, right?
Why is it better?
Why
is it better?
Because it's more exact, right? If I'm writing tan, I'm following a very specific, someone else's idea of what tan is. But if I'm developing my own page, my own prototype, in theory, I'm developing my own color scheme, my own, you know, sometimes they call it a branding Bible. And so I want ownership over the exact shade of those colors. So it's sort of, you can start with the basics, and really like basic red, it's like a jarring color that you don't often see on a lot of web pages. So usually if you want to do red, maybe you do like a lighter red or a softer red, or even like a darker, more regal looking red, right? So sometimes those basic red, yellows, and blues are just a little bit too bold for a web page, but it's kind of up to you. I mean, my style, I like these lighter colors. I think they look clean, but that could just be me, right? Okay. Now this is kind of ugly on my HTML, but the reason I'm doing it as a style is because I figured it'd be a little bit better from a lecturing perspective to show you the styling in real time rather than trying to hide it behind a class. So we can move these into CSS after the fact. But usually it's nice because maybe I decide that I want the borders to be a little bit thicker, then I can just do it all here rather than having to go to a different file. Also, now I got thicker borders. Okay. Another thing that I'm going to want to do. Oh, okay. So I made these fit onto a sort of more on each line, but it's probably going to look really weird if I try to make that screen small, right? They get real thin. So a good way to go responsive is to actually keep the excess, so the extra small, as 12, and then just say, you know what, once it gets above MD for medium, then we can make it, let's say, or how about we do SM for small? We'll make it, how about 6? So 6 would put 2 on each line, right? And then we could say call median, then we'll go 4, and then call large, then we'll go 3. Okay. So this is going to create sort of an order of a different hierarchy of arrangements based on screen size. So at its largest, I want to try to fit 4 on each page. At a slightly smaller screen, let's go down to 3. At an even smaller screen, let's go down to 2. Maybe as small as like a tablet sort of size. And then at the smallest, let's just put 1 on each line, right? So the bigger the number, that's just saying how much space on that 12 element grid do I want this element to take up. So the bigger the number, the more it gets its own line. Smaller the number, the more it's going to share it with others. So let's reload it. And then you can see it adjusts. So it's responsive as I make that screen smaller and bigger. Cool. So if you see that and you think, wow, that's really cool, then hey, maybe make your page responsive and try to make all the elements adjust based on screen size. Okay, any questions about that? Another thing I'm going to want to do is I'm going to want to make these, well, let's first make the text a little bit bigger. So for here, I'm going to do my 4 cursors again. And I'm just going to click down. And then I'm going to hold Command or Control, depending on whether you're a PC or a Mac, and then left arrow. And now it's going to send them all to the beginning of the line. So here, I'm going to give these all a P element. And then we're going to style that P element. Font size equals, how about 30? Just make it slightly bigger, more obvious font. Now I'm going to do the same thing. I held Command or Control and then the right arrow, and it brought my cursor to the end of each line. And then I'm just going to close out that element. Okay. So I reload, and now it's bigger. It's probably a little bit too big, actually, because it's even bigger than my title. So let's highlight the 30 pixels. And again, Command or Control D to create 4 cursors. And then let's turn that from 30 to maybe 20. Cool. All right, another thing that I want to do is I want to make them actually clickable. So I'm going to highlight sort of up to here, and you can see when I highlight it, it starts to highlight, hey, these are the other things that match what you highlighted. So if I hit Command D again, it's going to expand my cursor to the next one, then the next one, then the next one. And then I want to open up an A element, and then href equals quote. And then I'm just going to put a placeholder, right? So placeholder.html. Close that out. And then I'm going to hit enter. Then I'm going to hit the down arrow, tab, because I want this to go sort of within each element. Go back to the beginning, tab, enter, and then close it out. Okay. So essentially what I did was I put these all within a link. That way, these buttons will actually do something. So if I highlight it, you can see that they're all sort of ready to be clicked. Now, when I click it, it says your file can't be accessed. Reason being that I actually haven't created these HTML files yet, right? So we're just not there yet, but we will be. Okay. Let us create a button. I'll show you how buttons work, okay? So below all of this, so we've put, one thing I like to do here is I like to make comments. So if you do Command / on your computer, it will automatically comment out whatever you're going to type. I'm going to type menu buttons, or we'll call it menu choices, because these actually aren't buttons in the HTML sense. And then at the end, we're going to do another comment and then say buttons. So button is a very common HTML element. So I just wrote button within the element, and I'm going to say click here. Here it showed up sort of next to everything. I want to give it its own space. So I'm actually going to put this within a div. And then I'm going to give it that same grid. But I'm going to say no matter what, it's going to have its own space. So 12. So it takes up all 12 elements of the grid. There. Now it's on its own line. If I want to even create more of a division, I could create something like a do an HR that creates like this little line. It's kind of a nifty tool within HTML. So anyone know what, if anything, will happen when I click this based on how I've got it coded? Does anyone think anything will happen? Does anyone think nothing will happen?
Can you show your code again?
Have I written any JavaScript yet?
If anything, it might change to show if it's activated or not, like selected, if anything at all.
Kind of. So like I highlight over and it sort of gives this highlight. But when I click it, sort of it clicks, right? But nothing happens, right? So there's no real function. This is like the basic of what's built in within the button. Okay, so, and this is also an unstyled button. So if you don't style it all, it just is this basic gray button. Let's talk a little bit about styling. Since we have Bootstrap, why don't we do Bootstrap button? Okay. So you can see if I give a button some of these classes, they'll look kind of cool. Okay. So how about we do the success? So I'm going to actually just copy this. Well, you know what? Why don't I just copy the whole thing? Why not? And I'm just going to paste. Well, I'll put it next to the click here one. Okay. So click here does nothing. Success. Let's see if that does something. Nope, doesn't do anything yet, right? But it looks different. Maybe it looks a little bit nicer, depending on your aesthetic. If we go back to Bootstrap buttons, you can see there's plenty of other things that we could do as well. So, you know, let's say that I want to do maybe this danger button next to it. We could put that here. Reload my code, and now we have this danger button. Okay. It's kind of weird. It didn't turn red. Maybe try one of the others as well. How about warning? Maybe our Bootstrap, actually, this could be a good lesson. 3.4.1. Let's see what Bootstrap this. Oh, so this is Bootstrap 4.0. So this is actually kind of an interesting lesson. Sometimes if something doesn't work, it's just because you've got the wrong version. So if I do Bootstrap 4.0, src, how do we get it? Cool. So we'll use this instead. at the copy button. I'm going to delete what I had as my Bootstrap and replace it with 4.0. Now I've got to get not only the CSS, but also the JavaScript. So we'll put the JavaScript below that. Okay. So I just copied what they told me to put in there. And now I reload. And there, it works. But you can see that when I did that, it actually changed some of my other features too. So it's kind of up to you, how much you want to, use JavaScript 4.0 versus go with an earlier version. This is sort of something that people often run into when dealing with different versions. Okay. Why don't we try to see how to adapt this to the new Bootstrap? So Bootstrap grid layout. Okay. Yeah, I wonder why it actually made these all on the same page. I'll look into that and I'll let you guys know what happened in the announcement. But for the meantime, we'll just stick with the older version of Bootstrap. Okay. We'll take away these buttons. Let's add some function to the success button. Okay. So in my case, I've created this script that references the scripts file within SRC. So in my case, I've created this SRC folder and I've put scripts inside of that. So if I click that, I can start to add functionality to my button. Now, in order to use functionality, I do need to have a class. In this case, I have this BTN success. So that's nice, but it can be a little bit wonky to try to use a Bootstrap built-in class in order to do your own custom function. So I would recommend creating your own name, and it could be a class or an ID. The main reason you would choose a class or an ID is, think of it as an ID is perfect if there's only going to be one element like this. So if it's unique, a class is better if you're going to have multiple buttons that you want to do the same thing. So in this case, let's just make it an ID. So ID equals quote, and then we'll name this whatever. So success alert space. So another thing that I've sort of seen in some people's code, it's very important that within an element, if you're going to define IDs or classes, that it's sort of ID equals quote, and then whatever the name is. And the name cannot have any spaces between it. In this case, you have class, quote, and there is a space. The space is because these are actually saying two different things. So BTN is calling up the Bootstrap class for button. And then BTN success is calling a separate class for the success button. So one of them will tell it to look like this with this shape, maybe make it highlight when you hover over. Whereas success is what makes it green. Okay. So anytime you see an ID or a class with a space in it, that means that's two separate classes or two separate IDs. If there's a hyphen, it means it's a single ID or class. So I'm going to copy that, put it in here. Now, the way that you call an element in JavaScript and this is actually jQuery, is you do the $, parentheses, quote, and then hashtag, whatever that name is. So hashtag means ID. So when the success alert ID is clicked. And when I do click, what this is doing is it's creating what's called a click listener. So that means the JavaScript is basically listening on the page for someone to click whatever element has the ID success alert. So when this clicks, I want to perform a function. And then that function, curly brackets, do something, okay? So do something is basically what I want to happen when the success alert element is clicked. Okay, so there is a JavaScript function for alerts. Let's go ahead and Google that. JavaScript alert. W3 Schools, very good web page for figuring out specific answers for your site. And you can see it's a very simple thing. So display an alert box, you just use this code. So I'm going to go ahead and copy that. If I want to learn more about it, I can read below. But it basically says when you have this in your JavaScript, it will display an alert box with a message and an OK button. Go ahead and saving. Oops. I'm going to reload. And there we go. I clicked success and an alert box popped up that said, hello, I am an alert box. Now, maybe I want, instead of an alert, I want to confirm. Now, if I Google, well, actually, it's in the C also, so I don't even have to Google it. What is a confirmation box? A confirmation box is basically the same thing, but in addition to OK, there's a cancel button. And if it's cancel, then it won't do whatever the action is supposed to be. So confirm is a good, like, wait, are you sure you want to do this? If so, click OK. If not, cancel, and we won't do it. But we'll get to that after I do one more JavaScript function. So let's, instead of giving this an ID, let's give it a class, and let's call it click here to show. Okay. So now I'm going to create a listener for click here to show. Click here to show. Okay. So my hope, this is actually not going to work, but my hope would be, okay, since I put click here to show, that it would do the same alert box, right? Can anyone tell me why this is not going to work? Does anyone know what's wrong with this code? And it's basically the same thing as this, but with click here to show instead of success alert. So it should work, right? But what's wrong with this? I'll give you a hint. What's different between these two buttons? So we have success alert as an ID, click here to show as the button class. Can anyone think what's wrong with this code?
There's a hashtag.
Mm-hmm. So any idea what the hashtag should be instead?
No.
Okay, maybe we haven't gotten there yet. But you're right on point with that, right? So it's the hashtag is basically saying, look for an ID called click here to show. And in this case, there is no ID named click here to show, only a class. So if you want to call a listener or attach a listener to a class, you have to change the hashtag, or not use the hashtag, and instead use a period. So I'll just put this in the comments. Listener for the class, period, for click here to show. Right. So hashtag is for IDs, period is for class. Okay. Hello, I am a class alert box. So that way we can differentiate the messages. So success, hello, I am an alert box. Click here, hello, I'm a class alert box. Cool. Let's make it do something cooler, right? So how about we change, click here to show hide thing. And then in my function, let's try to show and hide or hide the menu. Oops. Okay, so the menu is all here. Now, if I want to impact it in some way, I'm going to need to put these all within a parent element. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to create another div. I'm going to highlight all the text and hit tab to indent it, and then close out that div. So now everything's within this div, and I'm going to give the div an ID that is called menu items. Now I can start to do things with this div, or with really everything within it, which would be this stuff. So I want to say, click here to show, will actually do something to my ID hashtag, or sorry, within quotes, ID, which is a hashtag, menu items, and then it's going to toggle them. So toggle, let's actually finish that again. Okay, so you can see here, the reason I wanted to finish it again is so I could show you what pops up is sort of my helper within VS Code. But basically what it's saying is that it is going to, it takes the inputs of whatever you're trying to show and hide, whether to force it. You know what, this is actually not that helpful. So I'll just tell you what it is. Toggle will either show or hide. If it's hidden, it will show it. If it's shown, it will hide it. So when you click an element with the class, click here to show, then it's going to do this alert, and it is going to toggle menu items. So it'll show it or hide it. Let's reload the page. Hidden. Shown. Hidden. Shown. Cool. Now, maybe I actually want to put this up top. So I'm going to delete it, or copy it first, then delete it. And then I'm going to try to put this right at the top. And I'm actually, I find this alert annoying. So I'm going to get rid of the alert. There we go. So just imagine on your site that you want to have a button that says like, find me insurance, and you've got a hidden map. Then you could use this button to, when it says find me insurance, you click it, and then the map appears. Okay. or maybe you're doing VR videos of surgeries. You want maybe there's several buttons. One says like GI, one says OBGYN, and you click that, and maybe it shows a different video that's hidden. Cool. So you can imagine this applying to all of your different applications. Okay, let's go back to confirm. Okay, so we'll do a JavaScript confirm. Okay, so I'm just going to copy that code. I want to confirm. Are you sure you want to toggle the menu items? If I click OK, they disappear. If I click OK, they reappear again. And then you can see that when I clicked cancel, it still did it, right? So that means that there's another step that I need to do. So go back here. And you can see it says if confirm equals true, then do the function, otherwise don't do it. So we will replace the confirm with our favorite text. So if that confirmation is true, then we do this function. And we actually don't really have an else, so I can get rid of this. But if I wanted it to do something else, then maybe I would. But for now, let's get rid of that. So it will only toggle if the confirmation happens. Okay, it toggles. Cancel, nothing happens. Okay, it toggles. Cancel, nothing happens. Let's bring back the else. Let's say that we actually want to maybe have an alert that says, oops. Let's see what happens. Cancel, and it says, oops. Right? So we don't want, that's sort of alert overload, but just to show you how you can use a confirmation to basically make a decision of what's going to happen. So let's say that you are going to have, are you sure you want like to, calculate the diabetes risk, and or are you sure you want to dose this patient? Then they click OK, then you would do basically all of your code to dose the patient within the true, and then else would just sort of be like nothing, right? Or something else that just doesn't involve dosing the patient. So it's a good way for you to have an alert to make sure that people intended to click the button. Any questions about that? This is sort of a big moment. I think if you can understand how to associate JavaScript with your HTML elements, then the possibilities of what you can do with your site are really quite limitless. But if you don't quite get it and you struggle with it, it's going to be hard to make your web pages work right. And usually what I find is it's just the very simple things that get people stuck. So now is a very good time to ask any questions that you might have about how to do this. So just to highlight a couple of the most important parts, to make JavaScript talk to my HTML, what I have to do is I have to label my elements somehow. So in this case, I've labeled my button with a class that is distinct. It says click here to show. In fact, it should probably be click here to toggle. All right. So let's try it again. Oops, nothing happens. Right. because I changed the name of the class, and my JavaScript has nothing that talks about click here to toggle. So to make that work again, I have to change that to click here to toggle. Now I reload, and voila, it works again. Okay, so going back to that, I have to label my element with something unique, and then I have to refer to that element in JavaScript, and then use something like a click function or anything else. And then within that, I can do stuff. And a couple of the stuff that we learned are alerts, as well as toggles. Now, if I only wanted this to show, so I actually don't want it to ever disappear, then one cool thing that I could do is I could actually give my menu items ID a style called display is none. And by the way, sometimes, Visual Studio Code, it thinks it's being helpful, right? You notice that it gave me an extra one. It thought that when I put the quotes in that I actually wanted to put something in here, but I had already opened it up. So sometimes you want to check to make sure that you're not doing anything like that. And just if it happens, just delete that extra quote. So that's the other thing that's important, is make sure that if you have a style, if you have an ID, any of these sort of like style, ID, class equals within an element. So these are the things that you learn in the HTML part of the Codecademy. You have to start that with a quote. So whatever is after that equals needs to be in a quote. And you also have to end that quote before you move on to the next thing, whether that be closing out the element using these carets, they call them, or if you're just going to move on to the next thing. So I did my class. Now I close out the quotes within that class and then move on to style. And then style will have its own quotes. Okay. So anyway, I gave my menu items a style called display equals none. There's display colon none. So now when I go to this page, no matter what, it's hidden. But when I click, and now this would be just show menu, it opens up. So you can imagine that being very helpful if you're doing a lot of work on your homepage and you realize that it's just so much stuff at once. I know some of the wireframes of these prototype projects, they were trying to do like 5 different things on one page. You can do that, but if you do that, you might want to hide it off the bat and then just have them choose, oh, are you a patient? Are you a doctor? Are you a provider? Are you a payer? And then based on what they click, it will show whatever's relevant for that particular person. Now I'll keep the confirm. Yeah, I'll keep the confirm just so that you can see how confirm works. But another thing I'll show, so I click OK. If I click it again, nothing happens, right? Because I changed toggle to show. So it's not going to hide it anymore. It's just always going to show it. But if I reload the page, it's hidden because I had set the style for all of my menu items as display equals none. And I did that by creating this parent div and then having all of those menu items within that div. Okay. Does that make sense? Anyone got any questions? Thumbs up if you're good. Again, this is a very critical part to understand. So I want to make sure you all get it. Okay. Another thing that I would like to show you. Okay, so my HTML is a little bit ugly. Let's try to fix that. So I know that I've got all of this stuff and I repeat it 4 times. So I'm going to copy this and I'm going to open up my CSS and I am just going to give this a class name. So I'm going to call this menu item. And since it's a class, we use that period. So that nomenclature is not just for JavaScript, it's also for CSS. And then I'm going to paste what I copied. And then I'm just going to click enter so that they're all on different lines. Delete that quote, doesn't need to be there for CSS. So now I have menu item as a class and it's defined. So I'm going to go back here. I'm going to Command or Control D, depending on whether you're a PC or a Mac, get my 4 cursors, delete all that styling, and then just add menu item to the class. So now if I reload, show menu, they look the same. Okay. But now my HTML is much cleaner. And just if I want to style these differently, for instance, maybe I want to center the words. I could just add that text align center. There, now they're in the middle. Cool. Or maybe I want to change my color again. How about make it like a violet? Maybe make it dark. There. Now that's really ugly though. So let's actually undo that. We'll go back to the blue book. There. All right. Another thing that I would like to show you is you can take advantage of some HTML methods that are provided by other companies. So videos is a good example of that. I'm going to actually create a new file. And I'm going to save it as video.html. And then let's just type something to make sure. Show me videos. And then within my index, I'm going to make this link instead of placeholder.html to video.html. Now, when I click that, it takes me to my video HTML text, right? My HTML file that says show me videos. Now, one thing that I could do is if I want to embed a video, how about maybe a video to my lecture? ALS414 YouTube collaborative coding. Okay, so I found it on YouTube, and now I would like to, I think it is within share, embed. So YouTube gives me this embed, which is basically a piece of code that I can copy. Copy. And then I can go to my code, paste that, and then it gives me an iframe, which will actually embed the video into my page. So now, if I reload this, you can see that there's actually a video on my video page. Now, I think it still kind of all looks a little bit ugly. So why don't we put it all within a div? Remember my large margins div that I created last time. We're going to put everything within that. Should we indent everything? And then how about we give the show me videos a header. So just copy this. And then replace this menu of cool features with show me videos. Okay, make sure everything's indented properly. Now reload. Oh, aha. Here's another thing. So notice that it didn't really change anything. We didn't get any of our formatting. Anyone have any idea why the formatting did not work? Anyone want to take a guess?
You didn't link the CSS?
Exactly. So we're actually going to need to copy. It's a good idea to just copy all of the head. So for every one of your page, make sure that you're linking the same files. So we're going to indent, and then we're just going to close out the body. There, now it's formatted. If I want the nav bar to be there too, then I would just copy that nav bar and then put that at the beginning of the body. There. And then we can maybe click, have a button, or really a link. So an ahref, go back to index.html. And then within that, we can put a button that just says, I click back, and it takes me back to my home page. Videos, back to the video page. You know, if we want to make sure that, you know, it's not wonky like this, we could create a div class call XS12, or I think you can also just use the term row. And now they're on different pages. I don't like that. Obviously, they're stacked like that. So let's see. That helps. That helped move it in the margin, but they're still kind of stacked. So what I could do is I could give this a style that says margin top 12 pixels. Make sure I close out those quotes. And now there's some breathing room. Cool. There. So now I can do some basic navigating on my page. Any questions about that? Okay, let us, I'm going to stop sharing. Let us break into our breakout rooms. And we'll have a team meeting, and I'll visit all the different groups, and we can talk about what might be missing, how I can help. And then if something comes up during those breakout meetings, maybe I'll cover some of that in the next half of lecture. So I'm going to create the rooms right now. They're open now.
Hi, Johnny.
Hi, how are y'all doing?
Good. How are you?
Doing all right. Any major questions I can help answer?
No, I think we were gonna check in and see where we're at, and then maybe we'll have questions afterwards.
Okay, great.
Professor,
Yes.
I have a question about our design is to create a chat message page. We need to create a database, or is just how to create a chat? I don't understand very well.
You definitely do not have to create a database. You have a couple options with chat, and I can go through some of those. One would be to use an existing chat feature. So Facebook, as an example, they have some built-ins that you could put in, and they could sort of use the basic Facebook messaging tool and embed that into your site, sort of just how I embedded YouTube into a site. We can do the same with messaging. Other options that you could do is you could use JavaScript to display what you type into a field into a chat screen. So that's an option as well. That's a little bit more difficult, but also more impressive and more customizable. So either way works.
So if we
Okay.
did go the Facebook route, just hypothetically, it wouldn't necessarily be tailored to our specific project, right? It would just be a general chat feature.
Exactly. So it won't
Okay.
have your branding. It won't have any other bells and whistles that you want. So that there's
Okay. I mean, I think that's fine because like the purpose of it was to have, it wasn't supposed to be like a person chatting with like a bot. It was supposed to act more as like a platform for people to chat with an esthetician.
great. Yeah. So that could
So I think that
definitely.
would work well.
Mhm.
Yeah, if you could highlight maybe how to do that, that would be great. If it's too much to do right now, we can even schedule
Yeah.
time in office hours.
Yeah, absolutely. I can show you all
Okay.
that.
Okay, thank you.
All right. Thank you.
Yeah. Hello. Hi.
Any questions? How are things going with the project? Are you feeling confident? Are you feeling lost? Any way I can help?
So we had some issues with like the push and pull requests for the initial link. So then Maria went ahead and made a new one, which works now.
Great.
And then Maria's not in class for today. She had to do something, but we're gonna work off of that. And then we're gonna put in like the navigator bar and then try to do the different menu items that we want. Yeah.
Great. Fantastic. So anything that I guess seems particularly intimidating for your specific project? Anything you'd like me to maybe go over a little bit in demonstrations?
I think Alec wanted to go to your office hours to ask about setting it up for his computer.
Yeah, I was having issues with the studio code. So I think I booked you for Thursday because
Okay.
that's the time that works for me. So yeah, I booked you for 30 minutes. So maybe we could like walk through that on Thursday and you can help me with that.
All right. Sounds good. Great.
Hi, Will.
Hello.
How are y'all doing?
I apparently
We're
I
making
messed up the code.
progress.
That's
No,
good.
she didn't mess it up.
I tried to like, okay, for example, like this is our front page. And then I'm like, was thinking of like trying to resize the logo. So then people can see this, not have to like scroll down. Everything is in one page in front of you.
For sure. Yeah.
And after this is like the list of questions that we have, but apparently I'm messing up the code. So, and I want, how, like, do we have anything that help us, like whatever that we create new page, all the size, all the logos will be the same, or we just have to copy and paste?
Yes. So what you could do is create a CSS element, right? So like a class element, and maybe call that logo hyphen image or something like that. It doesn't matter what you call it, as long as it's consistent. And then that way you don't have to keep resizing the image. As long as the image has that class, it will look the same. Now, the one thing that you will have to repeat every time is you'll still have to link to the CSS. So you would just want to make that a part of your routine anytime you create a new file. Would be
also like the same that you just did.
Exactly. So copy what's within head into the new file. That's not the ideal way to do it. I'll just be straight with you all. There's definitely better ways to do it, but I think introducing those ways at this stage would just be confusing. So I think it's better to just, when you create a new file, copy what you've got in the head into that new file.
Okay.
I have a question, Will. So our thing we were gonna make, like for our buttons to advance to the next question, I was thinking we could make like different HTML pages. Is that like the way to go to get the button to like, you know? Okay.
Well, so it's a good question. Yeah. That is a way to go. Now the downsides are that you're gonna have to keep doing that copying, the head and all that. So you might find that it's a bit tedious. If you don't want to go that route, the way that you would do it would be to use one single HTML file, maybe call that like the survey or the screener.html, and then you could have JavaScript that will show and hide based on what you answered.
Oh, okay. Like what we learned today in class.
Yeah, exactly. So maybe the submit button for question number 2 will hide question number 2 and show question number 3, that sort of thing. Or you could get real fancy and have the answer yes lead to whatever the yes should lead to, and the answer no might lead to a whole different decision path, right? So like a choose your own adventure type of thing. And then that way you have like a responsive screener that will take you to a certain destination based on what you answered. Okay. But those are all different ways of doing the same thing. So it's sort of with coding, there is no right or wrong answer. And with surveys, I mean, there's so many different packages that have been developed around surveys. So that there's literally dozens of ways to create a survey. And what you'll do is learn the most basic JavaScript way. And then you can use that knowledge to, in the future, if you ever want to build something like this, maybe adopt some of the more advanced techniques. Any other questions? Anything about sort of the team aspect? Do you all feel ready from a user testing perspective?
I think it's mostly just adding the CSS elements to make it look nice. Right now, it's kind of like a bare bones and it's not very like interactive and appealing to, like, I wouldn't want to take it right now.
Yeah, it's some people love doing the design, some people hate it. It really is. It's very rare that someone is good at both elements. So try to figure out who among you enjoys that part, and hopefully one person does. But if not, you'll at least learn along the way. And for me, I'm not going to judge you by like, oh, those colors clash or anything like that. I'm going to more judge you, are you using CSS, you know? So cool. Great work. It looks good so far.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, how
So,
are you doing?
Hello.
Oh,
do you want me to share screen so I can
yeah, go for
run
it.
the code?
Sure.
So, um, so share. So this is where we're at. We had to regroup, over the weekend to focus what we wanted to do.
Mhm.
So now we have a game plan and we like sketched it out on paper. So we're working on this drop down menu. So what we want, I'll just run the code so you can see. So we want to keep this like this, but we want it like off center, slightly off center. And then we're trying to figure out how to make this into more of a, and like a left navigation bar.
Sure, yeah. So this is, I can see where you're talking about the wonky is with the stuff on the bottom left, right?
Yeah.
But the fact that it is it's showing the bullets, right?
Yeah, that
What
I did that on the
tells me-
HTML side.
Yeah. So what that's telling me though is that the browser is reading that literally, because obviously you made it an unordered list. So that means that Bootstrap is not kicking in. So we'll have to figure out what about Bootstrap is not kicking in. And what I'm seeing off the bat is it looks like there is no Bootstrap being linked.
Well, yeah.
So if you Google, well, either Google Bootstrap or you could just try.
I didn't use Bootstrap. This is raw. This is like mine. Like this is like, I've used this for, I poached a project from my last degree. This is like mine.
Okay.
And like, it's very similar to how Bootstrap has it, but I didn't link anything except for this up here.
Yes.
And then I called in this up here.
Gotcha.
But I didn't use Bootstrap for this.
Okay.
Like, I figured I would start with what I know.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, so with that, I guess you'd have to look at your own code to figure out what's not working. So what is, I guess the question I would ask is, what is within your CSS that is not showing up on your page?
Well, everything, well, the colors aren't showing, the wrapper colors aren't showing. And well, it's not really, and I know there's this problem here because I have to change this function. Like that's just, there's going to be an error because the word needs to be changed, but I understand that. But this is just like for the icon and it's not showing it, like it should already be a bar on the side, or even if it's down here, it should be that blocked out color. Like, and
sometimes you just got to fix whatever the error is. So maybe delete. So it's sort of because that A is there. That could be a reason why none of the code is working. So you delete the A, maybe you can add it back in later.
okay.
That might be your problem. It does look like the wrapper section top navbar code. It looks like that's working to an extent because you have your background color showing up, right? That deep purple. does actually seem to be showing up on your page.
Yeah, but that's also the light gray is also from here.
But I'm saying the purple on the font, right?
Oh
So,
yeah, like after you click on it.
yeah.
But then when you like click on it for some reason, like you click on one and it selects all of them.
Yeah. It's tough for me to say because of custom code. I'm sure like if we took a deep look at it, we could figure out whether.
So is it better if I just revamp this with Bootstrap then? Make our lives a little easier.
If this is making your life difficult, then I would say yes. But it's all, you know, if this is, you know, the end game of what you want it to look like, then I would just say try to figure out what's different about your previous code where it worked.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm not gonna lie. So I'm taking point on the front end. I was very sick for a couple weeks. And so I was having to catch up on everything. And I honestly didn't have time to play around with Bootstrap. I've never used it before. Like all my other coding classes, you start from raw code, like you make it yourself kind of thing. So I did what I had because we had to have something to work with today.
Yep.
And in terms of participation, that's on me, not the rest of my team. I just wanted to put that out there.
Yeah, and no worries. I mean, I think your site is looking good. And I think there are definitely other teams that are not as far along. So like, I think you all should be proud of where you are at this point.
Oh, and figuring out this part was an addition to my code. I didn't have the icons.
Yeah.
I thought I saw someone else's code and it like rotates when you click on it. I'm like, oh.
Yeah, I mean, the fact that you're using the font awesome icons, it's definitely cool, right? You'll probably be the only team that's doing that. And that's a good introduction for your site. I think that there's definitely a lot of cool things that you can get using those font awesome icons.
Yeah, Leilani was saying like how like she envisions it, and jump in, Leilani, if you want to just tell them that these exist, but from what she's seen and like we've all seen, they're mainly geared towards pregnant women. So we want to target college students. And that's why like this video is just easy recipes. So these are people who got diagnosed early and they're just learning how to cook and take care of themselves. And that's where this idea of having the image, just making it more like young.
Yep, for sure.
But cool.
All right, great. I think you guys are off to a good start. I think the one thing I would say is try not to, if you're spending an inordinate amount of time on something, then sometimes it's better to just say, you know what, I'm going to skip this and work on something else, right? And for some people that's difficult. For me, that's difficult. If I see a problem, I don't want to like keep going at it until it's solved, but that's not always the most efficient way to spend your time. So it's definitely like no shame if you decide, you know what, we're just going to go a different route with the navbar. But hey, if you want to put the work in and you figure it out, that can be one of the more rewarding things in coding as well. So
yeah. Are there tutorials other than the Code Academy that we could go on? Like I went and I rewatched last week's lecture and it's blurry. Like I can't read your code on the YouTube videos.
Well, there is the GitHub itself. So everything that I'm coding in lecture, you can find in the GitHub, and that was on an announcement last week. You can always go to that. I'll try to comment all the code so that you can sort of see what's going on with it.
But could you like maybe not just specific to our group, because I know other people in the class would benefit if like you could recommend like video tutorials for us that like it's really hard to filter through and know what's good.
Sure. Yeah, I'll try to dig some stuff up and send them out. I think W3 Schools is great, but it's not a video tutorial.
That's where I learned how to do the FAS.
Yep. Yeah, I think you can learn a lot from W3 schools. So I'll try to get something together, and I'll post it as an announcement early this week. Okay.
Thank you.
Cool. Hi, how are y'all doing?
Oh,
Hello.
Any questions? Things
I
coming
think
up?
we're just trying to figure out what our next steps are. This is currently what we're working with. It's a very basic layout right now. We're planning on maybe adding like a search bar right here, and then having some kind of like a logging function connect to these two.
Yep.
And then we're basically thinking of like streamlining like different images, kind of like how Reddit does. That's what we have so far.
Great. Yeah, so I could try to maybe show you how a search bar might work. That could be helpful.
Okay.
But anything else is sort of the logistics, all that's figured out. You all know you can push code okay and all that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think.
Go ahead.
No, you did.
Do you have any idea how you could like potentially like upvote or downvote an image?
Let's see. So you could create a button, right? So you could imagine with the elements that we created in the first half of the lecture, maybe under at the bottom of each element, we would have like a thumbs up symbol and a thumbs down symbol. And each of those buttons might have a different ID or class name or something like that. And then you could have JavaScript code that would listen to a click on those elements and then do something based on whether someone upvoted or downvoted. So that could be one way to do it.
Like potentially move the image to the top, like, or like swap places with an image. Okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
that'd be cool.
There is Pablo worked on it too, and I was working on it, is getting like a post creation portion of like making a post, right? Like entering your text, uploading the image, all that functionality. I think we're both outsourcing to already made codes to try to figure out how to do that, because for the most part, most websites kind of use the same kind of template, it looks like. Do you have we both spent a lot of time on it. We didn't get anywhere. So do you have any advice on getting something like that together?
So like sort of like a messaging type of thing?
Not necessarily. I guess, yeah, I guess it would function like a messaging.
Or like a forum?
Yeah, like a forum.
Yeah, we could talk about that a little bit.
Okay.
You know, if you want like comments, right? That you can use, there's a built-in with Facebook. I can show you all that. Another team asked about that as well. And there's also ways that you can manually code posts. And I could show you that as well.
Okay, yeah, that'll be perfect.
Cool. Anything else? All right.
That's it on my end. Thank you.
You guys are off to a good start. Anything with user testing? Do you guys feel like you're ready? About that?
So I've basically taken that upon myself. I think it's more of just getting the website to a certain spot.
Sure.
To show someone.
Okay, great. My recommendation, I'll talk about this during the main lecture too, but would be to try to get at least one user test done this week, right? So that you've got something that you can work with next week. And you'll definitely want to at least have enough time to react to the feedback that you get.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Hi, how are you all doing?
Hello.
Any
Just doing
questions?
all right.
You feeling good? You worried?
Not really worried. But I think we do have a good plan.
Great.
Yeah.
Okay. And any specific questions about, things maybe you'd like me to go over in lecture, or any questions for me within the breakout group?
I think mainly just like linking things to other pages. I know we did it a little bit today, but probably more seeing that more.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, you're in luck because we'll be linking each of those elements within the homepage to their own HTML. We'll be doing that a good amount.
Nice.
Cool. All right. So what do you think is like the main feature that you're going to focus on for the prototype?
For me, it's sort of like making like a scenario-based sort of gameplay, because simulation will be really difficult. So like if we have a patient that has like, let's say they just got through with a gastric bypass, sort of have them be able to select like was it laparoscopic or open surgery, and then whichever one they sort of like toggle on, we'll sort of switch them to like a different form of the game. And then just sort of set them in a place where it gives them like reminders, like, I don't know, drink water, go walking, stuff that's like recommended for their recovery.
Yeah.
And then just have it sort of be like a as simple as possible type of Sims game. That's the goal. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I like that. I think you're on a good trajectory there. There's actually another team that's trying to do a little bit of a decision tree type of thing as well. So I can make sure we go through that a little bit of how one might do it during lecture.
Cool. Thank you.
Great. Do you feel like you're in a good place with user testing? You feel like maybe that's something you could get started on in the coming week?
Maybe like towards the end of the week.
Okay.
Early next week should be.
Yeah, I think that'll put you in a good position. I would say definitely try to target at least one user test success this week. And then try to make sure that you get the rest of them in with enough time that you can react to the feedback. Because that'll be a very important element is in your presentations that you got good feedback and you were able to build features that reflected that, right? So you're sort of reflecting that iterative process that we talked about. Okay.
That's good. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. Okay, coming back to you all. Any other questions? Anything come up that I can help with?
Yeah, I think we just have a time slot for tomorrow for your office hours.
Okay.
I believe from like 1:30 to 2, I believe so.
All right.
And then it's okay if we like, because initially our idea was like an app, and then we thought we had to change it to like a desktop website, but is it okay if we do like a mobile web page instead?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
And then I had a question about like the buttons actually. So I tried to do like the button group thing from the Bootstrap, and then, but it wasn't allowed. I couldn't like change the like CSS of it, because I think on Bootstrap it only allows like certain types. Is there a way that I can like override that somehow?
Yeah, so you could override it by creating your own class and just not using the Bootstrap. So that's only one way to do it.
Okay.
You can also use style. Style tends to override everything else. So style might work within the HTML. I can maybe show you all what a button might look like if I try to style it on my own.
Okay, thank you.
All right, cool. I'm going to close things out and we'll rejoin the lecture shortly. Okay, so just wanted to show a few JavaScript libraries. You should be able to click these from the file that I posted, or the PDF of this lecture. And then you can use that, any of these platforms if you want to try to improve your site. The way that you would install the library is simply by adding the script into the head of your HTML file. One thing that I want to emphasize with any sort of library importing is the order of the code matters. In general, we list jQuery first because there's a lot of libraries that depend on jQuery to work. So that's just one thing to keep in mind is if things aren't working, maybe it's because you try to put one of these other scripts above jQuery and it's dependent on jQuery to work. And so the way that the browser will read the code will be sort of from top to bottom. So you want to make sure you import some of the most important, most critical, most core libraries at the top. Okay, code conflicts. I'll show you an example really quick about what a code conflict might look like and how you can resolve it. Basically, what you need to do is you need to create a pull request and then resolve those conflicts. So I'm going to exit out of my presentation and I'm going to try to commit everything that I just showed you. Okay, so index, I'm going to add my video.html. That's a new file. I'm going to add changes, right? This menu item change that I put on my CSS. And then the new JavaScript that I added. And then I'm going to click check. I'm going to say commits from ALS414 6. I'm going to push. And it says can't push refs to remote. Try running pull first to integrate your changes. Okay, so that's a problem. The reason is because someone changed my index file before I got a chance to. So 10 hours ago, they changed it and I didn't pull my code 10 hours ago. So now I have a conflict. Okay, so what I can do is I can create a new branch. And maybe I'm going to call that Will's lecture 6 code. Maybe I'll push it there. So it says Will's lecture 6 code had recent pushes less than a minute ago. Compare and pull request. So you can see, I think the change, I don't remember what the change was, but I can sort so it's here. It just sort of calls out where the conflicts were. And then if I'm okay with it, I can create a pull request. And it says, you know what, you're good. Merge pull request. If I wasn't good, if they were like real differences in the code, it'll ask me to pick which ones I want to keep and which ones I don't want to keep. And then I'm going to confirm the merge. And now it says successfully merged and closed. You don't have to, but just as cleanup, I'm going to delete the branch. And now if I go to my code, I'll see that everything's been updated, or at least of the ones that I tried to change. Now, if I go to the page, well, actually first, another important thing, I want to now go back to my main branch. This is another thing that could trip you up if you ended up having to create a new branch. Hopefully you don't even need to do this. This is sort of just helping you troubleshoot. But if you had to create a new branch, make sure you go back to the old branch, right? And actually, so now I'm back on main, and then I can pull, and now I'm all good, right? Totally reconciled with GitHub. Very important, right? And I know sometimes we forget to pull, and that's sort of a way that we would work through that. So bookmark that part of the lecture. I'll post it on YouTube in case you run into this problem. You know, lecture 6 will help you out with that. Okay, so that's how you work through conflicts in your code. We already did our teamwork. A couple things I just want to highlight with the teamwork is ask yourselves, is your user testing protocol ready? I really think it would be valuable for you all to have at least one good user testing done this week. That way you can have enough time to react to the feedback that you get from that user testing to make your prototype as good as you possibly can. You know, think about what are the minimum functions that you're going to need to begin testing, and then get those functions in so that you can start testing. You also don't want to start testing too early when you really have nothing to show. And then work on delegating your tasks for the coming week. And then that's about it. I've got some action items that I'm going to take to help you all see examples of what you can do with your prototypes. Let's take a break right now, and then I'll show you a little bit more in-depth JavaScript coding. We'll do an algorithm around diabetes, and then we can wrap up the lecture. And it sounds like I'm going to be pretty busy during office hours this week. If you can't find a slot, send me an email and we'll try to work out a time. Try to propose times in your email. Okay, so let's take a 10-minute break. Let's come back at 4:43, and then we will do the rest of lecture talking about algorithms. All right, let's get started again. I'm going to share my screen again. Okay, I'd like to talk a little bit about JavaScript code and how it works sort of within the scope of algorithms. So at its base, an algorithm is essentially something that takes inputs and turns them into useful outputs. So a patient or a user might enter certain information. Maybe they click certain choices. Maybe they put something into a form. And then the algorithm will take all of that information based on what the user clicked, typed, whatever, and then we'll turn that into some sort of output, maybe taking them to a success page, taking them to a fail page, showing an alert that tells them that they are at risk of a certain disease. Maybe it just pairs them with an appropriate video or an appropriate other user. There's lots of different things that an algorithm can do. Maybe the algorithm is used to show someone an ad based on the cookies that are being tracked, to go back to an earlier concept that we discussed in the lecture. I made this a black box because sometimes an algorithm is a black box and people aren't really aware of how it works. They just know that it works. Now, in our case, we're going to know how it works because we are actually coding every element of that algorithm. An algorithm is not just code. It's not just a mathematical concept. In this case, this concept of how we go about diagnosing diabetes can be an algorithm. It's just one that is maybe operated within our brain based on our education. So you can look at this decision tree and it says things like, what are the plasma glucose level? What is the HbA1c level? And then if we say, okay, only the HbA1c is of a diabetic type, but the plasma glucose is fine, then our algorithm in our brain or our clinical decision matrix might tell us to re-examine. And then if it turns out that both plasma glucose level and HbA1c are diabetic, we know that they have diabetes. Let's say that we still find out that the glucose level is fine, then we might say, you know what, we suspect it, but we're not ready to give the diagnosis. And then we will just retest in 3 to 6 months. So you can see how even if it's just all words, all logic, it still can be an algorithm, okay? And I think that's a very important concept that, sometimes people miss. They think of algorithms as mathematical or coding concepts, but it really doesn't have to be. It's just a way, what are the inputs that you need? And based on those inputs, what sort of output can you give? In this case, a diagnosis of diabetes. Let's look at this a slightly different way. So this is how we might write code to do the exact same decision that we looked at in the previous slide. So you could take a variable and maybe call that diagnostic glucose or D-glucose. Doesn't matter what you call it, as long as you're consistent within your code. And then in that, you could have a certain number. Then maybe you have a variable called diagnostic HbA1c, and that could be a certain level or a certain number. Then you could create undefined variables such as glucose, so actual glucose, actual HbA1c, and symptoms. Sorry, these would be the thresholds. So 126 would be the threshold of high glucose. And then 48 is the threshold of HbA1c. So these are actually the thresholds that we're using for diagnosis. And then these are the inputs that the patient gives us, whether or not they had symptoms and what their actual glucose and HbA1c were. And then we can just write an algorithm in JavaScript saying, if the patient's glucose is greater than the threshold and the HbA1c is greater than its threshold, then tell them they have diabetes. If not, but only the glucose is higher than the threshold, then we ask them, hey, do you have symptoms? And if they do, then tell them you have diabetes. If not, then tell them, please test again in 3 to 6 months. So if we go back, that's actually the same as this, right? So if the glucose is exceeding threshold and the HbA1c is also exceeding threshold, then do tell them you have diabetes. However, if only the glucose level is of diabetic type, then we might re-examine and then ask them, do they have symptoms? That sort of thing. And that's sort of where this like suspecting diabetes mellitus kicks in. Okay, so let's actually code this. Let's go back to our code. Oh, by the way, since I had pushed everything now on the internet, wrosh.github.io has everything that we coded last time. Cool. So everything that I did on my computer now shows up on the internet. So pretty cool. But let's go back to my actual code editor and let's create the diabetes algorithm. And we'll put that into diagnosis. So now I want to.
So you're saying in terms of coding, any loop that you have, whether it's a for loop or an if else if, it's a loop, is a basic algorithm.
Yes. Yeah. An algorithm is just anything that makes a decision based on an input and then spits out some sort of output.
Huh. That actually makes the loops easier to understand. Thank you.
All right. So I'm going to go into my index.html and we're going to make an algorithm. So let's call this, how about diabetes.html, since this is going to be a diabetes algorithm. And I'm going to create a new file and I'm going to save it as diabetes.html. And just so that I'm consistent, I am going to copy the head and the body, close out that body, and now algorithm stuff I'm going to put here. Algorithm stuff goes. Okay, so we needed a few things, right? We needed, well, let's first put a title in. So let's copy that title from our index, and then we'll just say, call this, do I have diabetes? Now let's see what happens. So this is the internet. This is actually not going to work because I haven't pushed any code. So I'll close that tab. I'm going to copy the path. All right, now this is my local file. So it should be slightly updated. Let's show the menu. Click algorithms. There we go. We got our algorithm, our do I have diabetes. I also want large margins. So let's put everything within the large margins div. Okay. There we go. We need some inputs. So if you remember from your Codecademy HTML forms, there's an element that can be called an input element. Now we're going to make this actually not a text. Let's make it a number input. We're going to give it an ID, and we're going to call it D glucose. And then let's create another input for D HbA1c. Reload. Now I have two fields. Okay. Now I actually want them to be labeled. So what I can do here is I can create a label element for D glucose. And then we're going to just say this glucose level. Copy that. And then we'll call this label for HbA1c. And it'll be HbA1c level. All right. Now I've got some labeled forms or fields. Because it's a number, it won't accept. Or because it's a number, I can sort of hit up or down, whatever I want to do. And then let's create a button. Calculate risk. All right. Now with the button, I'm going to need an ID, right? Because no amount of JavaScript is going to work unless I have an ID. So let's call this calc diabetes, but doesn't really matter what I call it. And now I'm going to copy this and create a new line of code. We're going to call this the diabetes algorithm. And then we're going to create a listener with an ID called calc diabetes. And then when we click it, want to do a function. And then we can write our function stuff here. Okay, so calculating diabetes risk. All right. So what do we have to do? We have to get whatever the number is within this input, and then we have to get whatever the number is within this input. And then we got to do stuff with those inputs. So the way that we get the number within those inputs is we create a variable or var, and we're going to call it glucose equals. And then we're going to look for, oh, sorry, D-glucose is the threshold. So let's call this setting diabetes thresholds. So D-glucose, we're going to set that limit at 126. And then var DHbA1c, we will set that at 48, right? And that's just from what what we know from medicine. So you could really set this however you want. But for our calculation, we're going to use these constants as our diabetes thresholds. Now we need to get the inputs. So the way that we do that is we set var glucose, and then we're going to set that equal to, again, we're going to use jQuery to find our glucose ID. So the input with the ID of D glucose. Okay. And actually, you know what? I probably worded this poorly, because if D glucose is the threshold, let's just say glucose is the patient input. So I just got to make sure that I take the D's out of these. All that's important is that the ID matches what I'm asking for here. Okay. Now, HbA1c is right there. So I'm going to get my glucose variable, make that a lowercase g, from, oh, I did something wrong. Anyone know what I did wrong? Anyone know what's wrong with either of these, actually both of these lines?
Did you declare the variable correctly? Like you defined your variable as D glucose, DHB, blah, blah, blah.
Mm-hmm.
But when you calculate it, you're not calling the same thing. You're redefining your variable differently.
Yeah, so these are 4 different variables. So that part's okay. But if you notice, can you notice anything that's wrong here? So I have glucose. It looks like that matches my ID. But if you look at sort of how I've done these in the past up here, what am I missing here? It's right here.
Hashtag.
Yeah, exactly. You got to tell it that it's looking for an element with the ID of glucose and an element with the ID.
So in this case, is it like, is the hashtag in your indexing? Yeah, it's an index.
Yeah, so what you're doing is you're telling it, hey, look for any element that you've got in your HTML file that have the ID of glucose. If it was a dot, then it'd be saying the same thing, but look for any element within my page that have the class called glucose. In our case, we labeled them as IDs, so we use the hashtag.
I see.
And then the last thing we'll do, how about we'll just have an alert that's gonna say, glucose plus glucose plus HbA1c plus HbA1c. Now, in JavaScript, if I want to combine, text, you just use the plus. Okay. So what this should do is it should give me a pop-up that says glucose colon, and then whatever the patient entered in as glucose, and then HbA1c colon space, whatever they entered in as HbA1c. There's a couple things I did wrong, so I don't expect this to work. But let's just see. Let's see what happens. Okay, nothing happened. If nothing happens, the first thing you want to look at is what's going on here. Do I match? So this is looking for an ID, a button that's being clicked with the ID of calc diabetes. In this case, I have a button and the ID is calc diabetes. What could be wrong? This is the type of thing that could really, unfortunately, take a lot of time. So I want you to always almost write down a checklist of things to check for, right? So first thing, am I matching the ID name? Am I matching the class name? Am I actually calling for an ID or when I should be calling for a class or vice versa? These are some good things to look at. Another very important thing to look at is, am I importing the right file? So all the code that I've done is within scripts.js. But if I look on this page, I don't have scripts.js anywhere. So what I need to do is I actually need, and we'll just comment this, we'll say this is custom JavaScript. I copied the head, but I also have to make sure that I get this in. So I will put this at the bottom of my body, and now it should do something. There's one other thing I didn't do right, but we'll get to that. So let's say my glucose level is 100, HbA1c is 50. Calculate risk. Okay, so it did print out this this text string that I thought it was going to do, but instead of giving me a number, it gave me this weird object thing. The reason is because I defined glucose, which I'm printing out in the alert, as the entire element of glucose. And I defined HbA1c as the entire element, where we have this $sign in parentheses, and we're telling it to look for, the element with the ID glucose. This is actually setting it equal to the entire element. But if all I want is the number that the patient put in here, then what I do is I follow that up with val, right? And val is just short for value. So this is just a JavaScript function, this val and then the parentheses. And I'll do the same thing here. Let's reload. Let's say my glucose is 100, HbA1c is 50. All right, now we're getting somewhere. So what I've been able to do is take a patient's inputs into these fields, and I'm able to read them in my JavaScript. So I was able to capture those inputs. And now that I'm able to do that, I can start to do things with it, right? I can start to turn them into some sort of diagnostic algorithm. Cool. So I don't really need this alert anymore. That was just kind of like a debugging, right? I wanted to see if it worked, and if not, what was going wrong. But now that I know it works, I can move forward. Oh, one other thing, actually. Well, let's get to symptoms later. Let's just do the algorithm with glucose and HbA1c. So I'm going to do an if statement. And my if is going to be if glucose, and in that case, remember glucose was like whatever I put in, I think I put in 100, right? So if glucose is greater than D-glucose, D-glucose is 126, and this is just sort of JavaScript nomenclature, and HbA1c is greater than DHbA1c. So if what the patient inputs into the glucose field is greater than 126, and what the patient puts into the HbA1c field is greater than 48, then what? Then let's do an alert that says you have diabetes. If not, then let's do an alert that says you do, or hold on, what do we want to do? I think we wanted to check within, let's say check in 3 to 6 months. Put semicolons at the end. All right, so glucose, let's say it's 100, HbA1c is 50. Let's try that again. Calculate. Check again in 3 to 6 months. The reason is because I put glucose at 100, HbA1c at 50. So HbA1c was actually higher than threshold. So this criteria was met. But 100 is lower than this threshold. So this was not met. And for this if to happen, you have diabetes, both glucose and HbA1c must exceed the threshold. Because they both did not exceed, we got the check again in 3 to 6 months message. Now, if I reload, let's set my glucose at 150 and my HbA1c at 100. Now it says you have diabetes. So that's my algorithm. I just wrote before your eyes an algorithm that helps diagnose diabetes. Okay. One other thing we could do is we could add a checkbox. So how about we have another label, and we'll call this symptoms. Do you have symptoms of diabetes? We're gonna have another input. This type will be checkbox. Probably remember this from your Codecademy training. We'll give this an ID called symptoms. So now that gives us a checkbox. Now, just to see if things are working properly, let's just test this. So the way that we check a checkbox is a little bit different from the way that we check a number input. So in this case, the way that we would check is we would ask a different question. We would ask if, in this case, we want hashtag symptoms is checked. Okay. So if that is true, then we're gonna have an alert that says yes. Symptoms. Otherwise, an alert that says no symptoms. Let's just check out if that works. So I'm going to check it, calculate risk, yes symptoms. Reload, don't check it, calculate risk, no symptoms. Okay, so we know that that worked. Now you might ask, like, how did I know to type it like this? Essentially what you would just say is you would Google JavaScript, like check if checkbox is checked, right? So I do that. And then there's, many different ways to do it. I like WC3 schools. So you can actually see, oh, they actually did it a slightly different way. But they're doing it without jQuery. So it's like a little bit uglier to do this document get element by ID. So why don't we say jQuery, check if checkbox is checked. Don't see W3 schools, but Stack Overflow is another great website. And in this case, they did it our way, right? So they said that gets, if a checkbox is checked, basically you look for the ID of the element and then is checked. And you can see that that matches what we put here, okay? Stack Overflow, just a plug for them. I think it can really be helpful as you move forward with your projects. It's essentially a web forum, and someone asks a question. Usually that question is very much aligned with whatever the question you have is. And then people give answers. In this case, 25 people gave answers. So you can see all these different ways that people have come up with to do it. And the best ways are the ways with the highest upvotes. So there's really two things you look for. You look for the amount of upvotes. That almost always is the best answer, but also look at the date. So honestly, this one's going to work no matter what. Obviously, we saw, but sometimes you can look at a more recent date, maybe like 2016, and see, oh, maybe there were some new, simpler methods of doing it. In this case, you can see this person gave 4 different ways of doing the same thing. So that's one thing that I like about Stack Overflow is the answers, the people who answer are really encouraged to be very thorough in their answer. And sometimes they give multiple ways to do it and also the reasons why you might choose one method over another. A lot of how I've learned to code has been through Stack Overflow. So definitely would give a plug to that. Okay, so now that we've figured out the symptoms part, we can actually get one more layer in on our algorithm, okay? So instead of just doing if both thresholds are met, then tell them they have diabetes, otherwise tell them to check again. We can actually change this to an else if, and then we can ask a new question. So if they are not both met, then let's ask, well, is glucose at least met? And if so, ask another question. If, well, first we have to do something. Okay, so instead of doing this if with the alerts, what we're going to do is we're going to create a new variable called symptoms equals this is checked thing. Okay. So if it's checked, symptoms will be true. If it's not checked, symptoms will be false. I have an extra parentheses there, so should be good now. So if this is false, so if both of them don't exceed the threshold, but at least glucose does, then ask, do they have symptoms? If the answer is yes, then tell them they have diabetes. If it's not, then tell them to check again in 3 months. We have a couple layers now. And then otherwise give them that 3 to 6 months. So what are we saying here? We're saying if both glucose and HbA1c exceed the threshold, tell them they have diabetes. If not, but at least glucose exceeds the threshold, ask if they have symptoms, or at least check whether they checked that box. If they did, tell them they have diabetes. If not, tell them to check again in 3 to 6 months. This last else is basically, it says if both of them don't exceed the threshold and glucose does not, then tell them to check again in 3 to 6 months, okay? So it's sort of like a nested if. right? We're asking, do both exceed? Yes, you have diabetes. Both don't exceed, but glucose does, and they have symptoms. Yes, they have diabetes. If they didn't have symptoms and both didn't exceed, tell them to check again. And if both didn't exceed and glucose was one of the ones that didn't exceed, tell them to check again. And you can, of course, formulate this in any way you want. It doesn't have to be about glucose, doesn't have to be about symptoms. That's just the way that we're doing this in the example. So this is sort of a multi-layer algorithm now, because if my glucose is 150, but my HbA1c is low, let's call it 30, then, oh, hold on, I gotta reload. So let's say glucose is 100, HbA1c is 30, calculate risk, check again in 3 to 6 months. Now, if my glucose is 150, HbA1c is 30, also check again in 3 to 6 months. However, if I have symptoms, you have diabetes. Don't have symptoms, check again, right? So you can sort of see this logic of the algorithm in action, okay? So that's algorithms in a nutshell. Hopefully that got some of the juices flowing of how you might want to create an algorithm within your application. Basic principles are you could set certain rules or thresholds. You can also grab values. This is probably the most important part, the ability to take the values that a user is entering, and then you can do stuff with those values to give them certain messages. Now, also, maybe we'll highlight this next lecture, but we did alerts. You could also maybe, instead of doing alerts, maybe show something. So maybe instead of an alert, you're going to show an element that has like a map of diabetes doctors. Or maybe if it's check again, it shows a calendar, something like that, right? So you can see how you might be able to build other things that you're learning on top of the algorithm to make the website do cool things. All right. So going back to the slideshow. All right, assignments. Codecademy, let's finish up the JavaScript lessons. You should now have the basic skills of what you need to have really robust prototypes. And of course, I see it as my job now in the next couple of weeks to help consolidate those skills and show you the practical application of those skills for your prototypes. I have user tests with 5 users. What I'm really looking for is for you to start that user testing so that you can start to get good feedback that you can then use to iterate upon your prototypes to make them more user-friendly and more reflective of what the users are telling you. Okay, I really would love to see during your final presentations a couple of weeks from now, some sort of arc, right? Of, okay, we created this and then we learned something from the users, and then we added these features on top to reflect that. And now we love what we've got. Our users love it, blah, 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 right? So of course I'm available for office hours. If not, send me an email, propose some times, and we'll chat about what we can do with your particular applications, okay? Any questions for me? All right, well, it's 5:20, so you're free to go. I'll stick around if anyone has any individual questions.